The winter of 1867 struck the Texas plains with a fury that old-timers would speak of for generations. Samuel Crawford had seen harsh winters before, but nothing like the blizzard that descended upon his modest homestead that December morning. The wind howled like wounded wolves, and snow fell so thick a man couldn't see his own barn from the porch. Samuel was a widower of 43, weathered by sun and hardship, with calloused hands and a heart still tender from losing his wife Mary to fever 2 years prior. He worked his small farm alone now, raising cattle and horses, keeping mostly isolated from the nearby settlement of Fort Griffin. The solitude suited him, or so he told himself during the long, quiet evenings. On this particular morning, Samuel had ventured out to check on his livestock. The storm had been raging for nearly 2 days, and he worried about the animals in the barn. Wrapped in his heavy wool coat, he pushed through drifts that reached his knees, following the rope line he'd strung between the house and the outbuildings for exactly such occasions. He was nearly at the barn when he saw something that made him stop cold, and it wasn't the wind. A dark shape lay in the snow near the fence line, partially buried by the accumulating drifts. At first, Samuel thought it might be a calf that had wandered from the herd, but as he approached, his heart seized in his chest. It was a child. A girl. She lay curled on her side, her lips blue, her skin pale as the snow around her. She wore buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and fringe. Comanche, Samuel recognized immediately. Her long black hair was frozen in icy strands across her face. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. For a moment, Samuel froze himself, his mind racing. The Comanche were still active in these parts, though the wars had pushed most bands further west.
Taking in a Comanche child called man trouble. Serious trouble.
The army, the settlers, even his own neighbors might view it as consorting with the enemy. But then the girl's eyelids fluttered, just barely, and Samuel saw that spark of life still fighting against the cold. He didn't hesitate again. Scooping her frozen body into his arms, he carried her back along the rope line, fighting against the wind with every step. She weighed almost nothing, light as a bundle of kindling, and just as cold. Inside the house, Samuel laid her near the fireplace and began the careful work of warming her. He'd seen frostbite before and knew the danger of warming someone frozen too quickly. He removed her wet moccasins and the frozen outer layer of her buckskin dress, wrapping her in wool blankets. He heated stones in the fire and placed them around her, not touching her skin directly. He melted snow for water and managed to get a few drops between her lips. For hours, Samuel worked over her, stoking the fire, changing the warmed stones, massaging her frozen fingers and toes gently as circulation slowly returned. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of battle was being fought. As evening approached, the girl's eyes finally opened fully. They were dark and filled with fear. She tried to sit up, her hand reaching for a knife that wasn't there. Samuel raised his hand slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. "Easy now. You're safe.
He found you in the snow."
She didn't understand his words, but perhaps she understood his manner. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in her surroundings, calculating. Samuel could see the intelligence there, the survival instinct that had kept her alive in that frozen wasteland. He offered her water, then warm broth he'd prepared from dried beef. She drank hungrily, though her hands shook as she held the cup. They sat in silence as the storm continued outside, two people separated by language and culture, brought together by circumstance and compassion. Through gestures, Samuel learned her name, or something approximating it. She called herself something that sounded like Najwa, though he couldn't be sure. He pointed to himself and said, "Samuel," several times until she attempted to repeat it, though it came out quite differently in her pronunciation. As night fell, Samuel made her a bed near the fire from extra blankets and furs. She watched him warily but accepted the arrangement. He retreated to his own bed across the room, but sleep came fitfully. He kept wondering how she'd come to be alone in that storm, separated from her people. Had she been lost? Separated during a hunt? Was her band nearby, searching for her even now? The storm finally broke around midnight, and an eerie silence settled over the land. Samuel rose before dawn, as was his habit, and stoked the fire. The girl was already awake, watching him. Her color had returned, and though she moved stiffly, She seemed much recovered. Samuel prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried fruit. As they ate, he tried to explain through gestures that she should stay inside, stay warm. He needed to tend to the animals, to dig out from the storm. She nodded, seeming to understand, though her eyes never left him. He bundled up again and headed outside into a world transformed. The snow had stopped, and the early morning sun sparkled off drifts that had resculptured his entire homestead. The air was brutally cold but still, a dangerous, crystalline stillness. Samuel was halfway to the barn when he noticed the tracks. They were everywhere around his property, fresh tracks in the new snow. Unshod ponies. Many of them. His blood ran cold as he realized what had happened during the night. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the white landscape, and that's when he saw them. Warriors. Dozens of them. They sat mounted on their horses in a wide semicircle around his barn and house, so still they might have been statues. They wore buffalo robes and blankets against the cold, but their weapons were visible. Rifles, bows, lances. Their breath and their horses' breath created small clouds in the frigid air. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. He was a dead man. They'd surrounded him in the night, and he'd walked right out into the open like a fool. He had no weapon on him, nothing but a pitchfork leaning against the barn wall, useless against such numbers. For a long moment, nobody moved. Samuel stood in the snow between his house and barn, aware that arrows could fill him like a pincushion before he took another breath. The warriors watched him, their faces impassive. Then one rider moved forward, separating from the others. He was older, perhaps 50, with streaks of gray in his long hair. He wore a magnificent buffalo robe decorated with painted symbols, and he carried himself with unmistakable authority. A chief, or someone equally important. The warrior stopped his horse about 20 feet from Samuel. Their eyes met, and Samuel saw something there. Not rage, not bloodlust, but something else. Assessment. Judgment. The warrior spoke in Comanche, words Samuel couldn't understand. But his manner spoke clearly enough. He was asking a question. Samuel took a slow breath and pointed toward his house. "Your daughter," he said, knowing the man wouldn't understand the words but hoping his manner would convey meaning. "She's inside. She's safe. She was freezing in the snow. I brought her inside." The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly. He called out something, and two younger warriors dismounted and began walking toward the house. Samuel's instinct was to stop them, to protect his home, but he forced himself to remain still. Any aggressive move now would be his last. The door to the cabin opened. The girl must have heard the commotion. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in one of Samuel's blankets. When she saw the warriors, she cried out and ran toward them. The older warrior dismounted in one fluid motion and caught her as she reached him, wrapping her in his arms. He held her for a long moment, speaking rapidly in their language, checking her over for injuries. She responded just as quickly, gesturing back towards Samuel and the house. Samuel watched, not moving, barely breathing. Everything depended on what the girl said, on how she described what had happened. The warrior listened to his daughter, then looked back at Samuel with new eyes. He spoke to the other warriors, and several of them dismounted. Samuel tensed, but they didn't approach him aggressively. Instead, they began unloading items from their pack horses. The chief walked back towards Samuel, his daughter at his side. When he reached the farmer, he stood for a moment in silence, then placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that transcended language. Then the warriors began to leave gifts. They placed them in the snow before Samuel's house. Buffalo robes, beaded items, dried meat, even a fine pony with a decorated bridle. It was payment, Samuel realized, or perhaps something more, recognition of a debt that honor demanded be repaid. The chief spoke again, lengthy words in Comanche that Samuel wished desperately he could understand. But the meaning was clear enough in the warrior's eyes, in his manner, in the gifts that surrounded them.
You saved my daughter's life.
You showed honor when you could have shown cruelty or indifference. You are no longer a stranger to us. The girl approached Samuel and took his weathered hand in her small brown ones. She said something softly in her language, and though he didn't know the words, he understood. Thank you. Then the warriors mounted their horses. The chief lifted his daughter onto his pony and mounted behind her. He raised one hand to Samuel in a final gesture of respect, and then they were gone, disappearing across the white plains as silently as they had come, leaving only tracks in the snow and a pile of gifts that represented more than their material worth. Samuel stood alone in his farmyard as the sun climbed higher, warming the frozen world. His legs felt weak, and he realized he was trembling, not from cold, but from the release of fear and tension. He'd done a simple thing, the only thing his conscience would allow. He'd saved a freezing child. And in doing so, he'd crossed a boundary that few in his world dared to cross. He'd seen the humanity in the enemy, and they had seen it in him. The gifts remained in the snow, but Samuel knew the real gift was something else entirely. A moment of understanding between two worlds, a recognition that compassion could bridge even the widest divides. As he gathered the offerings and carried them inside, Samuel thought of his Mary and how she would have been proud. In a harsh land, in a brutal winter, in a time of conflict and fear, one small act of kindness had changed everything. The war between settlers and Comanche would continue for years yet. Blood would still be shed on both sides. But on this one morning, on this one small farm, there had been peace, and that was something worth remembering.